We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. In late May, Donald Trump threatened the EU, the European Union, with a 50% tariff on all goods coming from Europe. When that happened, stocks plummeted. Then Trump pushed the pause button, and then stocks climbed in value. Now the EU says they are ready for, quote, fast-track talks with Trump. Europe seems to be bowing to Trump, but what is this all about? Professor Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Brian. Glad to be here.
Well, we've missed you for the last couple of weeks, and you were, in fact, at least part of the time in France, and we're going to talk about the EU and the United States and its relations. We were talking before the show about how Europe is always talked about in the media as lagging behind the United States and China, especially in technology, high tech. There's no Silicon Valley equivalent. The U.S. and the U.S. media always complain that Europe has too many regulations. It's not productive. It's going backwards. And yet, you know from this trip and from your earlier experiences that the lifestyle and the social programs that people in Europe far exceed anything the United States has to offer for its own people. Anyway, that's part of the story, but I want to talk to you about what's going on. Why is the United States acting suddenly as if Europe is an adversary, or certainly Trump is? I mean, the United States restored European capitalism at the end of World War II, along with Japanese capitalism, revived it, gave it access to the U.S. market, but things seem to have changed. I want to get your take on what's actually going on here.
Yeah, I'm glad to do it. I should mention that I spent the last 2 weeks in Paris, France, and all I can say, and I should explain, my father was born in France. I have spoken French since I've been a child. So yes, I was a tourist. On the other hand, I know that culture. I know that country. I've been to France, 50 times in my adult life. This is a society that understands what it means to live in a way that indulges your sense of beauty, your sense of style, and your sense that you live in a community that has extremes of wealth and poverty, but not like in the United States, and without much of the tension that you feel coming to the United States. Getting off the airplane, I left from Newark, New Jersey, and flew to Paris. Getting off the airplane was an experience of tension kind of flowing out of your body as you accommodated to the pace of life, to the care with which every storekeeper arranges whatever that store sells. So it is aesthetically pleasing. So it is beautiful to look at, whether you buy something or not. And then again, the cuisine, the care that's taken in it, the way the buildings are all make you feel as though you're walking in an outdoor museum. With the care that's been taken and the beauty spread out before you as a matter of pride of the people involved. It is extraordinary. And if I might add a word to what you said, because in my experience as a professor here in the United States, every year I would explain to my students what was the normal social care taken of people in Europe, most Western European countries. I could see in their faces of my American students that half of them were completely awestruck, partly by what I was telling them, but partly by the fact that here they were, 18, 19, 20 years of age, and had never had a clue about any of this. and then the beginning of an anger as they began to understand why it might be that they had no clue. So here we go, because all of this was reaffirmed to me. Just to give you a smattering, I'm going to use the French example, but it applies to Germany, Italy, and many other parts of Europe, although less in Britain than in continental Europe. So first, when you graduate from high school or college and you take a job, your employer is required by law to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation every year. You don't have to wait for it. You don't have to depend on a union contract to get it. It is the law, because the unions and the socialists and the communists fought to get those laws passed so that they would become a structural part of what it means to go to work in that country. There are laws currently that make it illegal for an employer to bother you with social text communications after 7 p.m. at night. In other words, you are protected from having your job begin to encroach upon your personal life. What a remarkable culture to have developed such an idea. Okay? Then there's the health care. They have a cradle to the grave health insurance program. If you got injured, if you have an illness, you go and you get cared for. And most of the doctors, most of the time, are working on a governmental salary, and they don't depend on your paying a fee. You get a deduction on your income, like we do here for Medicare and Medicaid, but basically it's taken care of. You will never have what you have in this country as an epidemic, which is people facing bankruptcy because they have had the bad taste of getting hit by a vehicle or having an illness that they can't get coverage for, or can't get adequate coverage for, or that has exemptions, or has co-pays. You don't have this in France. Then we get to the university. There's no tuition. Let me say it again. There's no tuition. If you are pass the exams, which they have, a series of exams, and you go to the university, you have to pay for your room and board, which of course you would have had to pay for one way or another anyway, but you do not pay gargantuan tuitions. Higher education, like lower education, is free. You don't pay a tuition to go to elementary school. You don't pay a tuition to go to high school, public high school. And for the French, it never made sense why you wouldn't continue this through college, graduate school, or however high you can go in the educational process of the society. So it's a wholly different attitude. I look at a professor who, by the way, earns about as much there as we do here, but with an enormous difference. They're not worried about their kids' education in terms of money, the way my colleagues in my university life have always been. I have 2 children, me included. I had to worry. My wife and I sat around wondering how in the world we're going to handle the educational expense, which kept rising and rising. And when I tell my colleagues in France what it costs to go to school here, they look at me, because they are as uninformed about what the truth is here as we are about what the truth is over there. I mean, I could go on and on. The parks, I mean, the city of Paris is full of parks, huge ones, sort of like Central Park in New York, and then lots of little 2 and 3 block squares of smaller parks. They're impeccable. They are planted with different flowers according to the season. And the French are not neat. They throw their papers aside and they leave their bottles of bottled water, but they employ an army of people Once it gets dark, out comes the army, and because the French want it clean. So they get it clean, even though their own habits are not the greatest in the world at all. But they compensate for that. And the same is true of every building, of every neighborhood. The cleanliness is just. I mean, I live in Manhattan, and I know what I have here, and I know what I saw there, and I moved around. What I love most to do, my wife and I, we go for walks. Whichever corner of the city takes our fancy, we go there. It's just extraordinary. And it is no surprise to me, being reminded as I come home, that all of this and much more that I don't want to take the time to go over is unknown to the American people, unavailable to the American people. And those two things are not accidental. Because you don't provide it to Americans, you need to constantly repeat, this is the greatest country in the world, and nobody would be so lucky as to live here. I mean, it's just not true. It hadn't been true for a long time. But the repetition of the opposite, like so much of what our government does all the time, is a way of coping with the absence by asserting the opposite. That it is wonderful and tremendous and extraordinary, just extraordinary. Anyway, to your question. Mr. Trump, if I were to reduce his economic program, and it is a program, whatever you think of his blurting things out and of his hostilities and his neuroses, which are pretty much on display most of the time, it would be a mistake to assume that there's no method to the madness. There is. There is a plan here. There is a program. And one of the ways to reduce it to its core is to say that he understands, and when I say he, I mean, the entourage around him, his advisors, and all of that, who include economists like me, some of whom I know, and who have had educations pretty similar to my own. They understand that American capitalism is in trouble. We agree with them on that, I think. They have, however, a radically different explanation. For them, and here comes the core of it, for them, the United States has been played, has been abused, has been cheated, has been treated crudely and exploitatively. And the connivance of the Democrats made that possible. And the connivance of Bush-type Republicans also made that possible. It's almost as if, although we haven't gotten to that language yet, it's almost as if the evil Europeans, because they are very big in this story, had a fifth column inside the United States. They haven't come to that kind of speech yet, although I think they're getting there. But that the Democrats here, the liberals here, all of that, were weak and unable to prevent the U.S. getting ripped off by the rest of the world, particularly over the last 40 years. Is China developing dramatically? Yes, because they, quote, stole our technology, because they allowed Western capitalists in there and really went to town ripping them off. Wow. And so the solution, get rid of the Democrats. He did that in the election. Get rid of the Bush-type Republicans. He did that in the primaries the first time, pushed them out of the story. So now he's left with the people who cheated us. And so he developed, he couldn't have done it, but his advisors developed a formula. We are cheated to the extent, here's the story, to the extent that other countries sell more to the United States than we sell to them. See, they're cheating us. They're taking advantage of our wealth, our richness, our success as a capitalist country by selling us a lot more. So among the worst behaved, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and a whole host of other countries. You'll know which countries they are by looking on the inside of your shirt and seeing where it comes from. And now Mr. Trump presents himself as the person who's going to fix all of that, who's going to punish those bad countries that have abused us and make them pay for the access to this market what they should have been made to pay, but which the weak Republicans and the awful Democrats, increasingly, by the way, lumped as the radical left, which, if you know anything about the Bush family, has to make you smile or fall off your chair laughing, depending on your personal style. But that's what he's going to do. And so slapping tariffs became the weapon of choice. He doesn't need the Congress to do it because Congress ceded that power some years ago in legislation. So he can grandstand all day, every day, raising them, lowering them, postponing them, delaying them, hurting them. He's going to go after Apple Computer, a tariff against a company which violates virtually every law in the country. You can't do that. But, what difference does it make? He's out there punishing the people who have taken advantage of the United States. Now, let me unpack one thing about this because it reveals what is not so clear. The reality, of course, is radically different. The reason the United States buys much more from China or Vietnam or Bangladesh or any of the other relevant countries around the world is mostly because American corporations seeking higher profits closed their production in the United States starting in the 1970s and moved it to China and Vietnam and Bangladesh. And that's why we have these numbers that are in the formula Mr. Trump wants us to use. The decision to go over there wasn't made by China or Vietnam. It was made by brothers and sisters who are Americans, who happen to be in a position on the boards of directors of the corporations that made these moves. And they had to. They would never have enjoyed the profitability of the last 30 years that has produced the billionaires whose names we now all know. These are corporations who, for Mr. Trump to tell the actual story would not only mean who's he going to blame? You no longer can blame the Chinese or the Vietnamese or the Communist Party of China. You'd have to point the finger of blame where it belongs, which is on corporate America. And Mr. Trump is not an idiot. He's not going to do that because his career would come to a crashing end in a matter of days if he dared to go in that direction. So his story is now to be understood as making the evil foreigners pay in order not to blame the corporate leaders who made it all happen, who took the initiative, made the decision, no gun to their head, to go over there and make a lot of money doing it, which they did. Now, they didn't share that money, so they failed to get the popular mass of the American people to feel good about all of this. They thought they could get away with neoliberalism, with some abstract economics that my profession teaches, that free trade is some win-win situation, which it has never been. They kept mouthing that stuff. All the academics did it. All the mass media did it. All the politicians did it. It was a chorus that never stopped until the mass of the American people had it. That's all that stopped it. It really was the working class. It didn't have the ideology, because that's a failure of you and me. We're not strong enough to give the understanding that I'm trying to get across now. But the mass of people's anger, that was what Mr. Trump tapped. He could use the anger to keep the American empire going a little while longer than it might otherwise have been able to do. And how is he going to do it? By his program of punishing the rest of the world, tariff on you all, and letting it filter through the economy in higher prices, which is the equivalent of a tax on the mass of the American people. So the working class here will pay part of the freight of a program of punishing the rest of the world. And if that isolates the United States, that shows you that they are in trouble. They don't care. Because for them, it's either we do that or this empire, and we with it, go down sooner. So the bottom line here, we need to understand we're not dealing with a government that is handling us from a position of strength. We are struggling with a government that is desperate, that has no other way to survive, hasn't found any. Look at the Democrats. They don't offer anything as an alternative. They are the empty suit these days. He has a plan between sticking it to the American working class and sticking it to everybody in the rest of the world. Ally, enemy, doesn't matter. We're going to survive, and this is a plan to do it. And again, let's not get caught up in our own ideology. It's not just chaos. That's a mistake. There's a logic here. There's an intent here. There's a program here. And there are winners and losers if they succeed. And if they do, we will have another 20, 40 years of an American empire. One that will be limping, one that will be hurt. But right now, the squeeze is still on the foreigner and on the American working class, so long as both of them cannot or will not fight back.
So important, Richard, and I thank you for that perspective. You know, as we go, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I want to put a little bit of historical perspective real quick on it. And there's always a danger of oversimplification if we're speaking basically in shorthands, but I'm going to do it anyway. At the end of World War II, by 1943, 1944, the U.S. knew that the U.S. would win the war, that the Allies were going to win. And there was a conference, the Bretton Woods Conference, which we've discussed before in New Hampshire. And basically, the United States told the other countries of the world, the other major capitalist countries, the Allies at that time, they were all, yes, going to win, but they were winning at great cost. Their economies were in ruins. And the U.S. basically said, look, the dollar, the U.S. dollar, the currency that we can print will be the global reserve currency and the main currency used for world trade. The French later called that an extraordinary privilege, or maybe the French president called it an exorbitant privilege, one or the other. It was a privilege.
Right.
But the quid pro quo was that the U.S. dollar could be redeemed, meaning that all of the currencies of the other countries in the world would be fixed to the U.S. dollar, and they could always redeem their currency and thus their dollars, because they were fixed at the same rate, for gold. And up until 1971, if the French brought their francs or their dollars to the U.S., they could get gold in exchange for that paper, $35 for every ounce of gold. Now, in 1970s, in the early 70s, when the U.S. had spent so much on the Vietnam War, when inflation was starting to rage, when the U.S. government, the ruling class, had to make concessions and expand social spending, the French and the Europeans thought, well, look, the U.S. dollar maybe isn't such a good deal. And the French actually sent, as you well know, a battleship to New York Harbor to get gold and for their currency. And there was a great concern in the U.S. government that the U.S. was actually going to, quote, run out of gold if everybody actually demanded their gold. And so Nixon, under the advice of Milton Friedman and the Chicago economists, the Chicago School, they basically just said, okay, the currencies are going to fluctuate and you can no longer get gold for your currency. So the deal is off. It lasted from 1944 to 1971. But the deal's off. And as John Connally, Nixon's Treasury Secretary, said at the time, it's our currency, but it's your problem, meaning Europe just had to live with it. Anyway, I want to say this because I think it's so important to your point that the U.S. empire has been in different stages of decline. It's had some resuscitation, like when the Soviet Union fell and all that. Maybe the opening of China allowed U.S. corporate profit margins to grow for a while before the opposite started to happen. Anyway, this isn't the first time. There is a tension that goes with the nature of capitalism. It's a competitive system. There are, as you pointed out, it's not win-win. That's a fantasy. There's winners and losers. Anyway, I just want you to talk a little bit. I know you've talked about this a lot, and we only have about 4 or 5 minutes, but just reacting to where we are in the historical continuum.
Yeah, I'm glad you did that. Let me pick it up right where you left off. August 15th, 1971, President Nixon at the time, a conservative Republican, as we know, goes on the radio and the TV, and he says to the American people, I am not in these words, but roughly, I am going to shock you. I'm going to do two things that are shocking. First, having organized the entire world economy since 1944, just as you summarized a few moments ago, around the US dollar and its convertibility into gold, which we have stored in Fort Knox because of the two wars in the first half of the 20th century, which made everybody else who had gold store it in the United States because it was dangerous to do it anywhere else. London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, you wouldn't want to do that. And the rich people and the governments moved it. So we had it all. So, we're guaranteed. So he took that guarantee away. I want to stress, this is breaking a covenant. This is violating a treaty. This is abusing the people you have told can depend on you. It is the equivalent of Mr. Trump having written his name on the incarnation of NAFTA when it was renegotiated during his first presidency and simply walking away and saying, I'm going to put tariffs on Mexico and Canada, even though I wrote the treaty banning that, right? So this is a lesson for people who think that treaties mean something. They mean something so long as the people who sign them don't need to break them, whereupon that's what they do. And it would be naive to think otherwise. Okay, so what did that do? Well, it said to everybody, don't focus on the dollar because you can't convert it into gold. They won't give you gold. What you got is a dollar, and you better figure out how to manage that, which might include getting rid of it. But then what would you do with the wealth that you're getting rid of in dollars? In what form would you hold it? And the problem then, and it's still a problem today, is not that the dollar isn't deteriorating in value. It is. Not that the dollar is much less safe than it used to be. That's also true. But what's unfortunately also true is it's not so clear what's a better bet. The euro isn't, for all the reasons we can see. And the Chinese, while they are looking there, the yuan, their currency, is not quite at that stage yet. So we're in a limbo. And so what people are doing when they're in a limbo and they don't know how to hold their wealth, they go back to the ancient form, gold. And if you pay any attention, you'll know that over the last 6 months, the price of gold has gone through the roof, been a better investment than anything else you could have invested in. Pretty much. It's extraordinary what we're watching. Okay, the deal after August 15th, 1971 went like this. The United States is going to become the global hegemon beyond what it already was. We were that at the end of World War II. We became that even more after that speech in 1971. Because here was the way it was going to work. We are going to be the rich center of the world. We are going to buy everything we want from any corner of the world. Our military will make sure we have access to it. Our military will make sure it's at a price we want to pay. And we'll pay for it with these green pieces of paper that literally cost us nothing to produce. We will send you the green pieces of paper. And you know what you're going to do with them? You are going to lend them back to the United States so that the whole exercise will be us literally like a vacuum cleaner soaking up the wealth of the world, and you will all be lending us the money to do it because we're not rich enough to do it on our own. We need you to lend us the money, whereupon the United States became, over the last 30 years, the #1 debtor country on this planet. So we've been living in an even more bizarre imbalance in the last 30 years than we did in the 30 after World War II, because it's one thing to have a lot of gold and be able to do what they did for those 30 years. But it's another when the gold is no longer relevant and you're really just dealing in this paper illusion, because that will come to an end. When another country is beginning to produce goods and services that mean the world has an option. It doesn't have to deal with the United States. It can deal with some, and that's what we got. We got now an empire that has, for the first time, a real competitor. And in that situation, all of the arrangements are gone. The biggest problem for Mr. Trump right now is referred to in the financial press as the bond market. Let me close by making it clear. That's a euphemism for the following problem. The world no longer wants to lend to the United States. They have other things they want to do with the money. But the whole game is based on we get to consume like crazy, and you lend us the money to do it. But they won't. Americans won't lend to the American government the way they once did, and nobody else will either. And the United States is stuck. It can't continue to function if it can't play the game of the last 30 to 40 years, 50 years now, since 71. And so Mr. Trump is saying, okay, I'm going to smash the standard of living of the United States. We're not going to have to borrow. We're not going to let our people consume. So they can't borrow. They won't need to borrow because nobody will lend to them anymore. And we're going to punish the rest of the world. We're going to make the rest of the world fund us directly through the deals I cut, through the tariffs that will be charged them, and the damage we can do them if they don't knuckle under. That's all we have left. And here's the analogy. We're not the hegemon anymore ideologically. The Chinese have shown that their combination of private and state enterprise is much more successful in growing their system than ours is in growing ours. That train has left the station, and the whole world, except America, knows it. So we can't dominate ideologically. We can't dominate economically. What's happened with the last 4 wars we fought shows that. We can't dominate politically. We're the only country supporting Israel in the Gaza horror. The whole rest of the world even Europe is now washing its hands of all of this. All we've got left is the military. What a terrible idea. But it's paralleled in economics. All we have left is a program of savaging our allies, trying to savage our enemies, and hoping against hope it gives us a few more years. Although I would caution people about it. Retaliation is what the Europeans are working on right now. Retaliation is what the Chinese have already shown us. When the rest of the world figures all that out over the next few months, the difficulties of this country and of the path Mr. Trump has chosen to save it will become overwhelming. If I were Mr. Trump's advisor, I would tell him, the next midterm elections, unless you are very lucky, all of your plans will disappear.